Thank you, Stacy. My first question is, what is the current state of laws or lack thereof regarding transferring data that may contain biometrics within and outside the US?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. And again, I don't know, I'll try to keep my answers limited. And if you want to expand on them, by all means, tell me. So transferring data inside and outside the US. The way, just take the US first, right? The way that the US works is different than the way other countries work generally, right? We kind of focus, and pardon the analogy, we kind of focus on like a rifle approach. We target certain industries in the US by the way we deal with our laws. Whereas in Europe, for example, there are national laws that apply to everybody, no matter what industry you're in. Some exceptions to that, but generally that's the case. So when you're thinking about this question in the US, you're thinking about what industry am I in? What state am I in? But currently, there really isn't any generally applicable law that says you can't transfer data outside the US. It's a little bit more indirect than that. In the US, what it says is, look, if you have certain personal data, not all personal data, but certain special types of personal data, like social, like biometric, financial account numbers, state issued IDs, things like that, you have to have reasonable safeguards to protect it. The reason these laws emerge is because of identity theft. Identity theft has been a #1 crime to the FTC for the last almost 20 years. And in a way to curb those instances of identity theft, you have these reasonable safeguard requirements. And so if you're a business operating in the US, if you're a court-reported business and you have a lot of data, which sounds like you all do, you have an obligation in just about every state to safeguard that data. So what does that mean? There are different frameworks for safeguarding the data. If you do a lot of work with healthcare entities, you have to think about HIPAA. If you do a lot of work with insurance companies, you have to think about Gramm-Leach-Bliley. If you think about federal contractors, there are rules that apply through each agency to federal contractors, but they all have their own frameworks, which look a lot alike, but there are some differences. And one of those things is, well, what if you're going to transfer data outside the US? It doesn't say you can't do it. It just says, is it reasonable? Do you have reasonable safeguards in how you do it and the vendor that you send it to? And do you have an agreement with that vendor? Have you vetted that vendor and assessed what their safeguards are? So, so there's a different approach here, right? Is it reasonable? Have you safeguarded it? In the EU, one of the concerns there is that what's called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And the concern there from an EU perspective is they view the US as not having adequate safeguards. The reason that they view the US that way is because of a lot of the governmental surveillance laws that we have here, and they don't like that. So they feel like the only way you can transfer data to the US is if there are model contractual clauses, or there's something called the Privacy Shield, which followed the US EU safe harbor. There's some standards that have been evolving. Even the Privacy Shield is kind of not really in force right now. But the point is, if you want to transfer data from the EU to the US, you have to think about those things. And that includes, by the way, if a company in the US is going to access a database in the EU, that's a transfer, even though the data is not actually being sent here or stored here. That access could trigger those requirements. So again, at a high level, those are some of the, in broad strokes, rules around transferring data back and forth between countries.
That's helpful. And then leading into that on safeguards, what safeguards are there that restrict the use of the biometric information being analyzed for purposes other than the original recording when we're dealing with voice? And even with the safeguards, what are the risks when ethics are ignored?
Okay, so one of the things is when you say the original recording, right? And this is a question of kind of the technology you're using. So you can have a device where someone, you're trying to verify the identity of an individual, and you may scan, like a lot of the way the biometric devices work is someone will have a face scan, they'll have a fingerprint scan, and the device really isn't storing the fingerprint. It's not really storing your face. What's happening is it will capture the face, but then it will immediately convert what it's finding into a numerical code through an algorithm. And it stores that numerical code. And then when you come up again, it makes sure it can match the image that it's scanning at that subsequent period with what it's stored for you in its system. And that numerical algorithm, what a lot of the vendors have done have said, and this is what they claim, that cannot then recreate the fingerprint, right? So once you convert it to this numerical representation of the fingerprint, it can't be reverse engineered. And that's how you're protecting the biometric information, in the, other than in the original recording, right? When you look at, and this is, the litigation is still kind of evolving in Illinois, they haven't gotten to this issue really yet in terms of what exactly is biometric information. And they anticipated this because in the private cause of action provision, it allows for the recovery of expert witnesses, because there's going to need to be experts to figure this out and to convince a court, well, yes, this actually is or isn't, based upon complicated algorithms and stuff like that are beyond the scope of our discussion. But suffice it to say that that's, at least at a high level, the theory around how do we safeguard this so that the data that you're collecting at the first instance is then converted to a form that really can't be re-engineered back to the biometric. That being said, that's not to say that some devices don't record the geometry or the fingerprint or the voice print in a way that can be reused. And in fact, there are technologies out there that allow for deep fakes and things like that to engage in nefarious activities. And I think you also asked about what are the risks even when an ethics are ignored or safeguards are ignored. I think there's and I think you have some other questions about this, but there are a lot of different ways that biometrics can be used in society, and there's examples of where someone can use a voice print, for example, through an app, and then use it to get access to financial accounts. This has been happening. We've part of my work is helping companies understand what their vendors are doing. And just as one example, when we look at retirement plan vendors and how they validate the identity of plan participants, a lot of them are moving to voice prints. This is happening in the financial services industry, so it's natural for them to apply that same technology to bank customers, to their retirement plan customers. So now when you have a person who's trying to get a distribution from their retirement plan, they might have their voice print copied or developed by someone else. They call in, and now they speak through an app that the app recognizes as another person, and they can make elections to make distributions and loans, and all of a sudden the right person calls in and their account is diminished. So those are some of the things that can and have happened.